The collar shouldn't have been there. Caleb Mercer froze at the mouth of the cave, breath fogging in the cold, as Rex stood perfectly still, ears locked forward, not barking, just listening. The old leather collar lay on the stone floor, faintly pulsing like a heartbeat. Caleb's chest tightened. He'd seen that signal before. Overseas, on missions no one was allowed to remember. Rex stepped forward, paw touching the ground, and deep inside the cave, something massive shifted awake. Metal groaned. A hidden door hissed open. Then helicopters thundered overhead. Caleb whispered, "What did they make you, boy?" And Rex just stared into the dark. Some things are not lost, they are waiting. The wind moved softly through the pines, carrying the faint scent of stone and cold water as Caleb Mercer stood at the edge of the forest, his boots pressed into the damp earth, like he wasn't sure he belonged anywhere else. At 40, his shoulders still carried the quiet strength of a soldier, but the world had long since stopped calling him one, and now he lived between places, between days, with nothing but an old pickup truck and a dog who never asked where they were going next. Rex stood a few feet ahead, his silver-gray coat catching the pale afternoon light, ears high, body still in a way Caleb had learned to trust more than any map or compass. The dog wasn't looking at anything Caleb could see, not really, but he was listening, deeply, like the earth itself had whispered his name. "What is it, boy?" Caleb asked softly, his voice worn but steady, though something in his chest had already begun to tighten. Rex didn't bark. He didn't move. He simply turned his head slightly toward the ridge ahead, where a narrow opening in the rock cut into the hillside like a scar left by time. Caleb followed his gaze, and for a moment, the world felt too quiet, the kind of quiet he remembered from long nights overseas when silence meant something was about to change. The cave hadn't been there on any map he'd seen, and yet standing here now, it felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain, like a memory just out of reach. He stepped forward slowly, gravel crunching under his boots, each sound too loud against the stillness, while Rex moved beside him with careful precision, his tail low, but steady. As they reached the mouth of the cave, a cold breath of air slipped past them, carrying with it a faint metallic scent that made Caleb pause. It wasn't fear that stopped him. It was recognition. He had smelled something like that before, years ago, in places no one ever talked about once they came home. "We don't have to do this," he murmured, more to himself than to the dog. But Rex had already taken another step inside, his paws silent against the stone. The light faded quickly as they entered, shadows folding around them, and Caleb's eyes adjusted just enough to make out the rough walls, the uneven ground, the quiet drip of water somewhere deeper within. Then Rex stopped again, completely still. Caleb's gaze followed, and that's when he saw it. Lying on the cold stone floor, just a few feet ahead, was a worn leather dog collar, its surface cracked with age, its metal buckle catching a faint glimmer of light. It didn't belong there. It couldn't. Caleb felt the air shift around him as he stepped closer, his breath slowing, his mind reaching for something it didn't want to remember. The collar looked ordinary, forgotten even, but something about it felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain. Rex lowered his head slightly, not touching it, just watching, as if waiting for Caleb to understand first. And then, almost too faint to notice, the metal tag on the collar flickered once, like a heartbeat waking up in the dark. Caleb did not reach for the collar right away because something in the air had changed, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm when the wind forgets how to move and the world holds its breath, and Rex remained perfectly still beside him, his amber eyes fixed on the object as if it carried a language only he could understand. The faint flicker from the metal tag pulsed again, soft and steady, not bright enough to illuminate the cave, but strong enough to be seen. And Caleb felt a quiet unease settle deeper into his chest as memories he had spent years burying began to surface in fragments he could not fully control. He crouched slowly, the cold stone pressing through the worn fabric of his jeans, and extended his hand toward the collar, hesitating just inches away as if waiting for permission from something unseen. The leather was cracked with age, dry but intact, and when his fingers finally closed around it, a faint vibration moved through his palm, so slight it could have been mistaken for imagination, but Caleb knew better than to dismiss what his instincts recognized. Rex shifted then, not backing away but stepping closer, his nose hovering near Caleb's hand, his breath slow and measured, as if he was listening to something deeper than sound. "You feel that?" Caleb whispered, though he knew the dog did not need to question, because whatever this was, Rex had sensed it long before they ever stepped inside the cave. The flicker from the tag steadied, becoming a consistent pulse now, rhythmic and deliberate, and Caleb turned the collar over in his hand, his eyes narrowing as he noticed something he had missed at first glance. The metal tag was not just worn. It was etched, fine lines cut into its surface in a pattern too precise to be random, and beneath the dirt and age, there was a symbol he had not seen in years but could never forget. It was small, almost hidden, but it was there, a marking used only on classified equipment, something he had encountered during operations that never made it into official records. Caleb's breath slowed as the realization settled in, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a puzzle assembling itself whether he wanted it to or not. "That is not possible," he murmured, more to the cave than to Rex, but the silence that followed did not argue with him. Instead, it deepened, pressing in around them, until even the distant sound of dripping water seemed to fade. Rex let out a low sound, not quite a growl, not fear, but recognition, and he moved past Caleb without hesitation, stepping further into the cave as if drawn by something waiting ahead. Caleb rose quickly, the collar still in his hand, and followed, his boots careful against the uneven ground, each step echoing faintly in the enclosed space. The light from the entrance dimmed behind them, replaced by a soft, unnatural glow that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, reflecting faintly along the walls as they moved deeper inside. The air grew cooler, sharper, carrying that same metallic scent that stirred memories Caleb wished had stayed buried, and as the passage narrowed, the rough stone began to change. At first it was subtle, a smoother surface here, a straighter edge there, but with each step forward, the cave lost its natural shape, becoming something else entirely. The walls shifted from jagged rock to flat plains, cold and deliberate, as if carved not by time but by intention, and Caleb's heartbeat began to align with the steady pulse in his hand, the collar now warm against his skin. "This was built," he said quietly, the words barely more than breath, and Rex paused ahead, glancing back at him, not confused, not afraid, but waiting. Caleb stepped forward again, and the ground beneath his boots changed from loose stone to something solid and even, a surface too precise to belong in a place like this. He swallowed, his throat dry despite the cold air, and forced himself to keep moving, because turning back no longer felt like an option. Whatever they had found, or whatever had found them, was already unfolding. Rex moved again, his pace slow but certain, until he reached a point where the passage opened into a wider chamber, the ceiling higher, the air heavier, and there he stopped completely, his body still, his gaze fixed ahead. Caleb stepped up beside him, the collar still pulsing faintly in his hand, and followed the direction of the dog's eyes. At first, he saw nothing but darkness, a deeper shadow at the far end of the chamber, but then the light shifted slightly, just enough to reveal straight lines where there should have been none, edges too clean, angles too precise. Caleb took another step forward, his breath catching as the shape began to emerge, not all at once, but gradually, like something waking up from a long sleep. It was a door, or something like one, set seamlessly into the stone, its surface smooth and unmarked except for a faint outline that pulsed in the same rhythm as the collar in his hand. Caleb stood there, unmoving, the weight of the moment settling around him, because he knew without needing to be told that this was not abandoned, not forgotten, not truly. It had been waiting, and somehow, for reasons he could not yet understand, it had been waiting for them. Caleb did not move for a long moment, not because he was unsure, but because something deep within him recognized the shape before him in a way that went beyond sight, like a memory pressed into muscle and bone rather than thought, and the steady pulse from the collar in his hand seemed to answer the faint glow outlining the door, sinking in quiet rhythm as if two distant signals had finally found each other again. Rex stepped forward first, slow and deliberate, his paws silent against the smooth floor, his body calm but focused, and as he approached within a few feet of the door, the air itself seemed to shift, a low hum rising from the walls, not loud enough to startle, but present enough to be felt beneath the skin. Caleb followed, his breath steadying despite the tension in his chest, and as he closed the distance, the faint outline on the surface of the door brightened slightly, not a harsh light, but something softer, almost responsive, as if it was aware of their presence. "This is not just a door," Caleb said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of understanding he did not want but could not ignore, and Rex paused directly in front of it, his head tilting just slightly, ears forward, eyes fixed on the center of the surface. Caleb lifted the collar slowly, his hand steady despite the faint tremor that had begun to travel up his arm, and as the tag faced the door, the pulse intensified, no longer faint but clearly defined, each beat echoing softly through the chamber. For a second, nothing else happened, and the silence stretched thin, like a held breath waiting to be released, and then the surface of the door responded. A soft line of light traced itself outward from the center, forming a pattern that mirrored the etching on the collar's tag, precise and deliberate, each line appearing in perfect sequence as if following instructions written long ago. Caleb's eyes narrowed as recognition deepened, not just of the symbol, but of the purpose behind it, and a memory surfaced, sharp and clear, from a place he had tried to leave behind. A briefing room with no windows, a table covered in documents stamped with classifications he had never repeated out loud, and a voice explaining something that had sounded impossible at the time, something about adaptive systems, about responses that were not triggered by codes or keys, but by living signals, by presence, by something that could not be replicated by machines alone. Biometric, Caleb whispered, though even that word felt too small, too incomplete for what he was seeing now, and Rex shifted slightly, his body leaning forward just enough that his nose came within inches of the glowing surface. The hum deepened, not louder, but fuller, like a resonance building beneath the stone itself, and the light along the door brightened further, spreading outward in smooth lines that connected and expanded until the entire outline was visible, no longer hidden, no longer dormant. Caleb felt his heartbeat match the rhythm again, the same steady interval, the same precise timing, and he realized then that it was not just the collar responding, and it was not just the door reacting to the collar. It was responding to Rex. "You are the key," he said softly, the words forming without effort, because there was no other explanation that made sense anymore, and Rex did not move away, did not hesitate, but instead lifted one paw slowly and placed it gently against the surface. The reaction was immediate, but not violent, not sudden, just inevitable, like something completing a process it had been waiting to finish. The light flared once, then steadied, and a low mechanical sound followed, deep within the structure, a shift of internal systems waking from a long silence, and the seam in the door became visible, a fine line running vertically down the center. Caleb took a step back instinctively, not out of fear, but out of respect for something larger than himself, something he could not control, and as he did, the door began to open. It did not slide quickly or with force, but slowly, deliberately, as if time itself had a role in the movement, the two halves parting just enough to reveal a darkness beyond that was not empty, but filled with depth, with structure, with something waiting. A faint light emerged from within, not bright, but steady, illuminating the edges of what lay beyond just enough for Caleb to see shapes taking form, straight lines, surfaces that reflected faintly, equipment that had not been touched in years, and yet did not look abandoned. The air that flowed out carried that same metallic scent, stronger now, layered with something else, something sterile, something preserved, and Caleb felt the past press in around him again, not as memory, but as presence. Rex stepped back slightly, turning his head toward Caleb, his eyes calm, not alarmed, not uncertain, but expectant, as if this moment had always been part of the path they were meant to follow. And Caleb looked at him, really looked, seeing not just the dog who had stayed by his side through everything, but something more, something he had never fully understood until now. "What did they do to you?" he asked quietly, not expecting an answer, but needing to ask it anyway, and Rex simply blinked once, slow and steady, before turning back toward the opening. Caleb exhaled, long and measured, and stepped forward again, the collar still in his hand, its pulse now calm, almost quiet, as if its purpose had been fulfilled. He crossed the threshold slowly, the light from within guiding his steps. And as he entered, the space beyond revealed itself more clearly, not all at once, but enough for him to understand one thing with certainty. This place had never been meant to be found. It had been meant to be remembered by something that never forgot. The moment Caleb stepped fully inside, the air changed in a way that could not be measured, only felt, like stepping into a place that had been sealed not just from the world, but from time itself, and the soft glow that filled the chamber seemed to come from the walls, from the floor, from the very structure around him, steady and patient, as if it had been waiting without urgency for someone to arrive. Rex moved ahead with quiet confidence, his steps echoing faintly against the smooth surface beneath his paws, and Caleb followed, his eyes adjusting slowly as more details revealed themselves, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a memory returning in fragments. The chamber stretched farther than it had appeared from the entrance, its walls lined with panels that blended seamlessly into the structure, their surfaces clean despite the years that must have passed, and along one side, a series of consoles stood in silent order, each one dark but intact, as if they had simply been paused rather than abandoned. Caleb exhaled slowly, his breath steady but heavy with understanding, because he had seen places like this before, not exactly like this, but close enough to recognize the intention behind it, and the realization settled over him with a quiet weight. This was never meant to decay, he said softly, his voice carrying across the chamber in a low echo, and Rex paused ahead, glancing back briefly before continuing forward, drawn deeper into the space by something Caleb could not yet see. The faint hum that had begun near the door continued here, subtle but constant, like a heartbeat woven into the structure itself, and as Caleb moved closer to the consoles, one of the panels flickered faintly, a soft glow awakening beneath its surface as if acknowledging his presence. He stopped in front of it, his hand hovering just above the interface, and for a moment, he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of respect for what he might be about to uncover. Then, slowly, he pressed his fingers against the surface. The response was immediate, but gentle, the panel lighting up in a soft blue hue that spread outward from the point of contact, lines forming across the screen in patterns that shifted and aligned with quiet precision. And Caleb felt that same pulse again, not from the collar this time, but from the system itself, syncing with something deeper than simple recognition. Data began to appear, not in words at first, but in symbols, sequences that moved across the display with a rhythm that felt almost alive, and Caleb leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing as fragments of understanding began to surface. "It is still running," he murmured, more to himself than to Rex, and as if in response, the rest of the consoles began to awaken one by one, their surfaces lighting up in sequence, each activation smooth and deliberate, like a chain reaction set in motion after years of stillness. Rex stopped at the center of the chamber, his body still, his head slightly lowered as he listened, and Caleb followed his gaze, noticing now what he had missed before. At the far end of the room, partially obscured by shadow, stood a structure that did not match the rest, a circular platform raised slightly from the floor, its surface marked with the same etched pattern he had seen on the collar and the door. The light around it pulsed faintly, not bright, but steady, like a signal waiting to be completed. Caleb felt his chest tighten again, not with fear, but with the weight of recognition, because this was no longer just a hidden facility, and it was not just a relic of something forgotten. It was active, it had purpose, and somehow, that purpose involved Rex. "Stay close," Caleb said quietly, though the words felt unnecessary, because Rex had never left his side, not truly, and as Caleb stepped toward the platform, the air seemed to shift again, growing denser, charged with something he could not define. Each step felt measured, deliberate, as if the space itself was guiding his movement, and when he reached the edge of the platform, the light beneath his feet brightened slightly, responding not just to his presence, but to something carried with him. The collar in his hand warmed again, the pulse returning, stronger now, more defined, and Caleb looked down at it, his grip tightening slightly as the pieces began to connect. This was not just tracking, he said under his breath, the realization forming fully now, undeniable and clear. This was never about location. Rex stepped onto the platform then, Without hesitation, his paws settling into place as if guided by instinct rather than command, and the moment he did, the entire chamber responded. The hum deepened, the lights across the walls brightened, and the consoles behind Caleb shifted, their displays changing in unison as new patterns emerged, more complex, more structured, and for the first time, readable. Caleb turned quickly, his eyes scanning the nearest screen, and there, finally, the symbols resolved into something he could understand. Not instructions, not warnings, but records. Rows of data, organized with precision, each line marked with identifiers he had not seen in years, and at the top of the display, a designation appeared, simple but unmistakable. Subject response log. Caleb's breath caught, not sharply, but steadily, as if his body had already accepted what his mind was still processing, and he looked back at Rex, who stood calmly at the center of the platform, his gaze steady, his presence unwavering. "You were not just trained," Caleb said quietly, the words carrying a depth he could not fully express. "You were chosen." The system pulsed again, stronger this time, and the light beneath Rex shifted, forming a pattern that extended outward across the platform, lines connecting, expanding, completing something that had been left unfinished, and Caleb felt it then, not as a thought, but as a certainty. This place had not been waiting for a person. It had been waiting for him because of the one who never left him. And whatever this system had been designed to do, it had just begun. The light beneath Rex did not fade after it spread across the platform. It deepened, settling into a steady glow that felt less like illumination and more like acknowledgement, as if the system had recognized something essential and was now adjusting itself accordingly. And Caleb stood just at the edge, watching not with fear, but with a growing sense that he was no longer observing something unknown, but something he had once been part of without ever realizing its full shape. The consoles behind him continued to shift, lines of data reorganizing themselves with quiet precision, and one by one, new panels came to life, their displays clearer now, no longer abstract, no longer hidden behind layers of unreadable symbols. Words began to form, simple at first, then structured, and Caleb turned slowly, his eyes scanning the nearest screen as if drawn by something calling him to understand. Subject identified. Status active. Response level stable. He felt his breath pause for just a moment, not out of shock, but because the language was familiar in a way that went beyond memory, and as he stepped closer, more lines appeared beneath the first, each one building on the last with a calm, deliberate rhythm. Genetic response verified. Neural pattern consistent. Access granted. Caleb swallowed, his throat dry, as the meaning settled deeper than the words themselves, because this was not a machine reacting to a code or a device. It was responding to Rex. He turned back toward the platform, his gaze resting on the dog who stood at its center, calm and steady, his chest rising and falling in a slow, even rhythm, as if none of this was new to him at all. "You knew," Caleb said quietly, though the words carried no accusation, only wonder, and Rex did not move, did not react. But there was a stillness in him that felt intentional, like a quiet agreement with something Caleb had yet to fully understand. The light beneath Rex shifted again, not brighter, but more defined, the pattern extending outward in fine lines that traced across the platform and into the surrounding floor, connecting with other unseen systems embedded within the structure, and Caleb felt the ground beneath his boots hum softly, not unstable, but alive with purpose. He turned back to the console, drawn again to the information unfolding there, and as he moved, a new section of the display activated, its surface clearing before presenting something that made him stop completely. Archive initializing. Memory sequence available. Caleb's hand hovered over the interface, the hesitation returning, but this time, it was different. It was not uncertainty that held him back. It was the weight of what he might see. For years, he had lived with fragments, pieces of his past that never fully connected, missions that ended without explanation, details that were sealed away not just by orders, but by time itself. And now, standing here, those missing pieces felt closer than they ever had before. "If this is what I think it is," he murmured, his voice barely more than breath, "then none of this was an accident." Rex shifted slightly on the platform, his ears flicking once as if acknowledging the moment, and Caleb exhaled slowly before placing his hand against the panel. The response was immediate. The display dimmed briefly, then reformed into a new sequence, this time not lines of data, but images. At first, they were faint, indistinct shapes moving across the screen, but as the system stabilized, the picture became clearer, and Caleb felt his chest tighten as recognition settled in. It was a facility, not unlike the one he stood in now, but active, filled with movement, with people, with purpose, and the angle shifted slowly, as if guided by an unseen observer, revealing more of the space with each passing second. Then figures appeared, men and women moving with focus, their uniforms marked with insignias Caleb had not seen in years, and among them, handlers walked beside dogs, German shepherds like Rex, each one alert, each one moving with a discipline that went beyond simple training. Caleb leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing as the footage continued, and then he saw something that made his breath catch. One of the dogs turned toward the camera, its coat silver gray, its posture steady, its eyes sharp and aware, and for a moment, Caleb could not tell if he was looking at the past or the present. "That is you," he whispered, the realization forming without effort, and Rex remained still, as if the confirmation had never been in question. The footage shifted again, the angle changing, moving deeper into the facility, and now the focus was not on movement, but on process. The dogs were being observed, not in a clinical way, but in something more deliberate, more intentional, and as the sequence continued, text appeared alongside the images, annotations that clarified what Caleb was seeing even as they raised more questions. Response to environmental signals. Adaptive neural link confirmed. Subjects display nonlinear awareness. Caleb stepped back slightly, the meaning settling into place piece by piece, and he ran a hand over his face, the roughness of his stubble grounding him in the present as his mind worked to reconcile what he was seeing. "They were not just training you," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the weight behind it. "They were studying something they did not fully understand." The footage continued, the sequence moving forward in time, and the tone shifted subtly, the pace slower now, more focused, as if the system was guiding him toward something specific. A new label appeared on the screen, larger than the others, its text clear and unmistakable. Primary subject, Rex unit designation active. Caleb's eyes widened slightly, not in disbelief, but in recognition of something that had been hidden in plain sight all along, and he turned back toward Rex, who stood at the center of it all, not as a participant, but as the one everything revolved around. "You were never just with me," Caleb said softly. "You were always leading me here." The system pulsed again, steady and calm, and for the first time since they had entered the cave, Caleb felt not uncertainty, but clarity, quiet and undeniable, settling into place like a truth that had simply been waiting to be seen. Caleb did not speak for a while after the system confirmed what part of him had already begun to accept, because some truths did not arrive with force or shock. They settled slowly, like dust in still air, until everything looked different without anything actually changing, and Rex remained at the center of the platform, steady and quiet, as if he had been standing there long before Caleb ever understood why. The screens behind him continued to shift, not rapidly, not chaotically, but with a calm progression, each line of data aligning into something more complete, and Caleb turned back toward them, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by a need to understand what this place had been waiting for. The display changed again, the previous footage fading into a new sequence, one that felt closer, more immediate, and as the image stabilized, Caleb felt a familiar tension return to his chest, not from fear, but from recognition of a moment he had lived through without ever seeing it clearly. The screen showed a field, open and quiet, bordered by low structures that blended into the landscape, and the light suggested early morning, the kind that carried a pale stillness before the day fully arrived. Figures moved through the space, their steps measured, their focus steady, and among them, a younger version of Caleb appeared, his posture straighter, his expression sharper, the weight of experience not yet fully settled into his features. Caleb leaned slightly closer, his eyes narrowing as he watched himself move through the scene, and there was something in the way he carried himself then that felt distant now, not wrong, just incomplete, like a version of himself that had not yet learned how much silence a man could carry. Rex was there too, younger but unmistakable, his coat darker, his movements quicker, but his eyes the same, always watching, always listening to something beyond what others could hear. "I remember this," Caleb said quietly, though the words felt strange as they left him, because memory had never held this moment so clearly before. The footage continued, showing Caleb kneeling beside Rex, adjusting a harness, his hands steady, his voice moving in quiet instructions that the system did not capture, and yet the connection between them was unmistakable, not just handler and dog, but something deeper, something that did not rely on commands alone. Then the angle shifted, moving away from the open field and into one of the structures, where the environment changed from natural light to controlled precision, and Caleb felt his breath slow as the interior came into view. It was a room not unlike the one he stood in now, though smaller, more active, with personnel moving between stations, their focus directed toward a central platform where Rex stood, calm and still, much like he was now. The difference was in the atmosphere. Then it had been filled with urgency, with purpose defined by immediate goals, but here, in the present, there was only stillness, as if the urgency had long since passed, leaving behind only intention. Text appeared alongside the footage, annotations that filled in what memory had never provided, and Caleb read them slowly, each line adding weight to what he was beginning to understand. Primary interface response confirmed. Subject displays stable linkage. Human companion presence enhances signal consistency. Caleb's eyes lingered on that last line, his brow tightening slightly as the meaning settled in, because this had never been about Rex alone, not entirely. "We were both part of it," he said softly, the realization forming with quiet clarity, and as if the system had been waiting for that understanding, the footage shifted again. The new sequence was different, quieter, less structured, and the lighting suggested a later time, perhaps days or weeks after the previous recording. The same facility appeared, but there were fewer people now, fewer movements, and the tone had changed, not chaotic, not urgent, but uncertain, as if something had reached a point no one had fully prepared for. Caleb watched as his younger self stood near the platform, speaking with someone just out of frame, his posture tense in a way that suggested disagreement rather than confusion, and though the audio was not present, the intent was clear enough. Then Rex moved, stepping off the platform without command, without hesitation, his path deliberate, and the system reacted, lights shifting, displays adjusting, not in response to a command, but to his movement alone. Caleb felt a quiet chill move through him, not cold, but recognition of something he had not understood at the time. "You were not following orders," he said, his voice low, steady. "You were making them." The footage paused briefly, then resumed, but now the focus was not on action, but on outcome. A final line of text appeared across the display, larger than the others, its message simple, but carrying a weight that settled into the room itself. Project status, incomplete. Primary subject released. Return condition, undefined. Caleb exhaled slowly, the air leaving his lungs in a measured breath as the pieces came together, not as a revelation, but as a confirmation of something that had always been there, waiting beneath the surface of everything he thought he knew. He turned back toward Rex, who stood calmly at the center of the platform, his presence unchanged, his gaze steady, and for the first time, Caleb did not see a companion who had stayed with him through everything. He saw the reason everything had unfolded the way it had. "You were never lost," Caleb said quietly. "You were sent back." The system pulsed once more, soft and steady, and somewhere deep within the structure, something else began to shift, not loud, not sudden, but certain, like the next step in a process that had only just begun. The shift did not come with sound, but Caleb felt it before he saw it, a subtle change in the air that pressed gently against his senses, like the moment just before something long buried decides to move again, and Rex remained still at the center of the platform, his posture calm but alert, as if he had been expecting this exact moment all along. The glow beneath him softened, no longer expanding, but stabilizing into a steady pattern that extended outward across the chamber floor, connecting to lines that Caleb had not noticed before, faint pathways embedded into the structure itself, now illuminated with quiet intention. Caleb turned slowly, his eyes tracing those lines as they spread from the platform toward the walls, toward the consoles, and beyond, disappearing into sections of the facility that remained hidden in shadow. "It is not finished," he said under his breath, the realization settling into place without resistance. And as if in response, one of the far panels activated with a deeper tone, its surface brightening more than the others, drawing his attention with quiet certainty. He stepped toward it, each movement measured, his boots echoing softly against the smooth floor, and as he approached, the display shifted, clearing the previous data and replacing it with something new, something that felt less like information and more like instruction. System re-engagement required. Primary link established. Secondary sequence pending. Caleb's brow tightened slightly, not from confusion, but from the weight of what those words implied, because whatever this system had been designed to do, it had not reached its intended conclusion. It had been paused, left incomplete, and now, with Rex standing at its center once again, it was continuing. He placed his hand lightly against the panel, and the display responded immediately, expanding into a larger interface that extended beyond the boundaries of the screen, projecting faint lines of light into the air, forming a three-dimensional map that hovered just inches above the surface. Caleb stepped back slightly, his eyes scanning the projection as it stabilized, revealing the layout of the facility in precise detail, every corridor, every chamber, every hidden section mapped with quiet accuracy. The platform where Rex stood pulsed gently at the center of it all, a steady point from which everything else extended, and as Caleb watched, a new section of the map illuminated deeper within the structure, beyond the visible chambers, in a place that had not yet been accessed. "There is more," Caleb whispered, the words forming without effort, and Rex shifted slightly, turning his head toward the direction indicated by the map, his ears lifting just a fraction, as if confirming what Caleb had already begun to understand. The path forward was not random. It was being shown to them. The projection adjusted again, narrowing its focus to a single corridor that extended from the current chamber into the deeper section, the path highlighted with a soft, steady glow, and Caleb felt a familiar sensation return, not fear, not hesitation, but the quiet awareness of a mission unfolding, step by step, just as it had years ago. Only this time, the purpose was no longer hidden behind orders or commands. This time, he was choosing to follow it. "All right," he said softly, his voice steady as he turned back toward Rex, who had already stepped off the platform, the light beneath him fading just enough to indicate that the first phase had completed. "We finish what they started." Rex looked at him for a brief moment, his gaze calm, unwavering, and then he turned, moving toward the corridor indicated by the projection, his steps quiet but certain, and Caleb followed without hesitation, the collar still in his hand, its pulse now faint but present, like a reminder rather than a guide. As they moved deeper into the facility, the air shifted again, becoming cooler, more still, the faint hum of the system following them, not fading, but adapting, as if the structure itself was aware of their movement and adjusting in response. The walls along the corridor were smooth, unmarked at first, but as they progressed, subtle details began to emerge, faint etchings similar to those on the collar and the platform, repeating at intervals, forming patterns that felt intentional, almost like markers left behind to guide those who knew how to see them. Caleb ran his fingers lightly along one of the markings as he passed, the surface cool beneath his touch, and a faint memory stirred, not fully formed, but enough to confirm what he had already begun to accept. This was never about control, he said quietly, more to himself than to Rex. It was about connection. The corridor narrowed slightly as they continued, the ceiling lowering just enough to change the acoustics, their footsteps echoing more distinctly now, each sound carrying forward into the darkness ahead. And then, gradually, the space began to open again, the corridor giving way to another chamber, larger than the first, but different in structure. This one was not centered around a platform, but around a series of vertical panels arranged in a circular formation, each one dark, inactive, waiting. Caleb slowed as they entered, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the details, the symmetry, the intention behind its design, and then Rex stopped once more, his body still, his gaze fixed on the center of the circle. For a moment, nothing happened. The air remained still, the lights steady, the system quiet, and Caleb felt that familiar pause again, that sense of something waiting for a final piece to fall into place. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the collar in his hand warmed once more, its pulse returning, stronger than before, and at the same time, one of the panels flickered to life, its surface illuminating with a soft, steady glow. Caleb did not move immediately. He did not need to, because now he understood. This was not just a system reactivating. This was a sequence unfolding, one step at a time, each moment dependent on the last, and whatever came next would not just reveal what this place had been designed for. It would reveal why Rex had been brought back at all. The panel did not brighten all at once. It awakened slowly, like something remembering its purpose after a long and patient silence. And Caleb stood at the edge of the circular chamber, watching as the soft light spread across its surface in thin, deliberate lines that mirrored the patterns etched into the collar still resting in his hand. Rex remained motionless at the center, his body calm, his breathing steady, but there was a shift in him now, something subtle yet unmistakable, as if the stillness he held was not passive, but active, like he was listening to something deeper than sound, something that existed just beneath the surface of everything around them. The air in the chamber grew denser, not heavy, but charged with a quiet presence that made even the smallest movement feel significant. And as the first panel fully illuminated, the others followed, one by one, each activating in sequence until the entire circle glowed with a soft, unified light. Caleb exhaled slowly, his eyes moving from one panel to the next, taking in the symmetry, the intention, and the undeniable sense that this was not random, not experimental, but designed with precision for a purpose that had been carefully protected. "This is the next step," he said quietly, though the words felt less like a conclusion and more like a confirmation of something that had already begun. The hum within the chamber deepened slightly, not louder, but more defined, and the light from the panels shifted, focusing inward toward the center where Rex stood, and for a moment, everything aligned, the glow, the sound, the stillness, all converging into a single point of quiet clarity. Then the panels changed. The smooth surfaces that had once displayed only light began to reveal something beneath, layers of information emerging slowly, not overwhelming, but deliberate, as if each piece was being offered rather than forced into view. Caleb stepped closer to the nearest panel, his gaze narrowing as the first lines of text appeared, clear and steady, and unlike the previous data, these words felt different, less technical, more direct, almost as if they had been written to be understood rather than decoded. Primary phase complete. Subject response verified. Initiating final sequence. Caleb felt his chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what that meant, because there was no longer any question that this place had been waiting for a conclusion, something that had never been finished, something that now, somehow, depended on them. He turned his head slightly, his eyes moving back to Rex, who had not moved, who had not reacted, but whose presence seemed to anchor everything unfolding around them. And for a moment, Caleb simply watched him, not as a handler, not as a companion, but as something more, something he was only now beginning to understand. "You are not just part of this," Caleb said softly. "You are the reason it exists." The system pulsed again, and this time, the response was immediate, the panels brightening in unison as a new sequence began, and the chamber itself seemed to shift, not physically, but in presence, like a space transitioning from waiting to action. A faint tone emerged, low and steady, carrying through the air with a rhythm that matched the pulse Caleb had felt since they first entered the cave, and as it continued, the panels adjusted, their displays changing from text to something else entirely. Images formed, not recordings like before, but projections, three-dimensional and precise, rising slightly from the surface of each panel, creating a layered view of something Caleb had not expected to see. It was not a place. It was a pattern, lines of light interconnected, forming structures that resembled networks, pathways that extended outward in all directions, each connection precise, each point linked to another in a way that suggested not control, but communication. Caleb stepped closer, his eyes moving across the projections as they shifted and aligned, and as he watched, he began to understand what he was seeing. "It is not a system," he whispered. "It is a network." The realization settled in quietly, but with undeniable weight, because this was not about a single location, not about a hidden facility buried in stone. This was something larger, something that extended far beyond the boundaries of this place, something that had been designed to connect, to respond, to exist in more than one point at a time. Rex shifted then, just slightly, his head lifting as if responding to something Caleb could not yet perceive, and the projections reacted instantly, their patterns adjusting, expanding, new connections forming as if the system itself was responding to his presence in real time. Caleb felt his breath catch, not from surprise, but from the clarity that followed, because this was no longer about what had been built. It was about what was still active. "You are not just the key," Caleb said, his voice low but steady. "You are the signal." The panels pulsed again, brighter this time, and the projections shifted once more, converging toward a central point within the chamber, a focal position that aligned perfectly with where Rex stood, and as the light intensified, a final sequence began to form, the lines of the network collapsing inward, focusing, narrowing, until only one path remained illuminated. Caleb followed it with his eyes, tracing its direction as it extended beyond the chamber, beyond the corridor they had entered from, reaching toward a place he could not yet see, but could now feel. Somewhere deeper, somewhere still waiting. The chamber fell into a quiet stillness once more, the hum steady, the light stable, and Caleb stood there, the weight of understanding settling fully into place, because now, there was no doubt left. This was not the end of something forgotten. This was the beginning of something that had never truly stopped. The light did not fade after the projections collapsed into a single path. It held steady, like a quiet promise that something beyond this chamber was now within reach, and Caleb stood motionless for a moment, letting the weight of what he had seen settle into something clearer, something he could follow without hesitation. Rex was already facing the direction of that final illuminated path, his body angled slightly forward, not tense, not uncertain, but ready, as if the next step had always been part of him, something instinctive rather than instructed. "All right," Caleb said softly, more to himself than to the dog, though the words carried a quiet resolve that had not been there before. "We go where it leads." The panels dimmed slightly behind them, not shutting down, but receding, as if their role in this part of the sequence had been fulfilled, and the glow along the floor extended outward, forming a clear line that guided them toward a narrow passage on the far side of the chamber, one that had not been visible when they first entered. The opening was subtle, almost hidden within the structure, but now it stood defined by a soft edge of light, its presence undeniable. Rex moved first, his paws silent as he stepped off the center of the circle, and the moment he did, the glow behind him shifted, following his movement rather than remaining fixed, and Caleb felt that same awareness again, the sense that the system was not simply guiding them, but responding to them in real time. He followed closely, the collar still in his hand, its pulse now faint but steady, like a distant echo of everything that had already unfolded, and as they entered the passage, the air grew cooler, sharper, carrying a stillness that felt untouched by time. The corridor sloped downward slightly, the floor smooth beneath Caleb's boots, and the walls on either side were marked with the same etched patterns they had seen before, though here they were more frequent, more concentrated, as if this path had been reinforced, not physically, but intentionally, to ensure it would not be missed by those meant to find it. Caleb ran his fingers lightly along one of the markings as he passed, feeling the precision of the lines beneath his skin, and a thought surfaced quietly, not forced, not sudden, but certain. "This is not just guidance," he said. "It is confirmation." Rex continued ahead, his pace steady, his ears moving slightly as if tracking something beyond the visible, and the faint hum that had followed them through the facility grew more focused here, not louder, but more directional, like a sound with intent, guiding them forward step by step. The corridor narrowed briefly before opening again into a larger space. But this chamber was different from the others, less structured, less defined, as if it had been left in a more natural state, the walls blending between carved precision and untouched stone. The light here was softer, more diffuse, coming from sources Caleb could not immediately identify. And at the center of the room, where the illuminated path converged, stood something that made him stop. It was not a platform, not a console, not even a machine in the way he had expected. It was a structure, simple in form but precise in design. A circular frame rising about 4 feet from the ground, its surface smooth and unbroken, with the same etched patterns running along its edge, though here they were more intricate, more layered, as if this was not just another part of the system, but the point it had been building toward all along. Rex slowed as they approached, his movement becoming more deliberate, and when he reached the edge of the structure, he stopped completely, his body still, his gaze fixed on the center of the frame where nothing appeared to be, and yet Caleb felt the presence of something there, something unseen but undeniable. The collar in his hand warmed again, the pulse returning, stronger now, more defined than it had been since they entered the cave, and Caleb stepped forward carefully, his breath steady as he moved closer, his eyes narrowing as he tried to understand what he was looking at. "It is not empty," he said quietly, though the words felt almost unnecessary, because the space within the frame carried a weight that could not be ignored. Rex lowered his head slightly, his ears tilting forward, and for a moment, the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath, the hum fading into a near silence that made even Caleb's own heartbeat feel louder than it should have been. Then, without warning, the air within the frame shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint distortion, like heat rising from pavement on a summer day, but here it was colder, sharper, bending the light just enough to reveal that something was there, something that had not been visible before. Caleb felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with recognition of something he had never seen, yet somehow understood, and as he watched, the distortion deepened, forming faint lines that mirrored the patterns on the collar, the panels, the platform, everything leading to this moment. "It is connecting," Caleb whispered, the realization settling in as the lines grew clearer, aligning into a structure that existed not in solid form, but in presence, like a bridge forming between 2 points that had always been linked, just waiting to be seen. Rex took a single step forward, placing one paw just inside the edge of the frame, and the response was immediate, not explosive, not overwhelming, but absolute. The distortion stabilized, the faint lines locking into place, and the space within the frame became something else entirely, no longer empty, no longer undefined, but active. Caleb did not move. He did not speak, because now, he understood what this place had been waiting for. And whatever was about to happen next was not something they had come to find. It was something that had been waiting for them to arrive. The moment Rex's paw settled fully within the frame, the air did not just shift, it responded, as if something unseen had finally received confirmation that what it had been waiting for was no longer approaching, but present, and Caleb felt it ripple outward from the center, not as force, but as alignment, like 2 distant signals finally locking into the same frequency after years of silence. The faint lines within the frame sharpened, no longer wavering, no longer incomplete, forming a structure that existed somewhere between light and presence, and Caleb took a slow breath, steadying himself not out of fear, but out of the understanding that this was no longer something he could observe from the outside. This was something he had already stepped into. Rex did not move. His body remained calm, his posture grounded, but there was a focus in him now that Caleb had only seen in moments where instinct and purpose became the same thing, and as Caleb watched, the space within the frame deepened, not visually, but perceptually, like looking into something that extended beyond what the eyes could measure. "It is not just opening," Caleb said quietly. "It is recognizing." The collar in his hand pulsed once, strong and clear, and for a brief moment, Caleb felt a sensation travel through him, not painful, not overwhelming, but precise, like a signal passing through a path that had always been there, just waiting to be used. The chamber around them dimmed slightly, not darkening, but shifting its focus entirely toward the frame, and the hum that had followed them through every corridor and chamber now settled into a single tone, low and steady, like the sound of something holding itself perfectly in balance. Then the surface within the frame changed again. What had once been distortion now formed into depth, a layered space that seemed both near and impossibly far at the same time, and faint shapes began to emerge within it, not solid, not fully defined, but structured enough to suggest form. Caleb narrowed his eyes, stepping slightly closer, careful but unable to resist the pull of understanding that was forming in real time. It was not another room. It was not another chamber hidden within the facility. It was something else entirely, something that did not belong to the same physical space they occupied, and yet it was connected, anchored here by design. "It is a bridge," Caleb whispered, the words coming without effort, because there was no other way to describe what he was seeing, and Rex shifted slightly, not stepping further, but adjusting his stance, as if maintaining a position that allowed the connection to remain stable. The faint shapes within the frame became clearer, not fully visible, but enough to reveal patterns that mirrored what they had seen on the panels, on the platform, on the collar itself, and Caleb realized then that this was not just a connection between places. It was a continuation of the same system, extending beyond a single location, beyond a single point in time. The system was not contained. It was distributed. The thought settled into him with quiet certainty, and as it did, the frame responded again. A new sequence began, not on the panels, not on the consoles, but within the space itself, lines of light forming along the inner edge of the frame, converging toward a central point that had not been visible before. Caleb felt his breath slow, his focus narrowing, and as the lines completed their path, something appeared at the center. At first, it was only a faint outline, barely distinguishable from the surrounding space, but as the system stabilized, the shape became clearer, more defined, and Caleb felt a quiet recognition settle over him once more. It was another interface, not physical in the way the consoles had been, but present, responsive, waiting. Rex remained still, his gaze fixed on that central point, and Caleb understood without needing instruction that this was the next step, not something they were meant to watch, but something they were meant to engage with. He stepped forward slowly, the collar still in his hand, its pulse now steady and calm, like it had reached the state it was always meant to hold. And as he approached the frame, the air shifted slightly around him, not resisting, not pushing back, but acknowledging his movement. He stopped just at the edge, close enough to feel the subtle change in temperature, the faint difference in the space within the frame compared to the chamber behind him, and he hesitated for only a moment, not out of doubt, but out of respect for the boundary he was about to cross. "We were never meant to find this," Caleb said softly. "We were meant to complete it." Rex's ears flicked once, a small, quiet motion that felt like agreement, and Caleb lifted his hand slowly, extending it toward the center of the frame. The moment his fingers crossed the threshold, the system responded. Not with force, not with sound, but with clarity. The space within the frame solidified around his hand, not physically, but perceptually, like stepping into a place that had been waiting for him specifically, and the interface at the center reacted instantly, its faint outline brightening, aligning with the pulse of the collar, with the presence of Rex, with Caleb himself. Data began to form, not in lines or symbols, but in structure, information presenting itself in a way that did not need translation, because it was not being shown. It was being understood. Caleb's eyes widened slightly, not in shock, but in the quiet realization that whatever this system had been designed to do, it was no longer operating as it once had. It was adapting. It was responding. And for the first time since they entered the cave, Caleb understood something that went beyond the system, beyond the facility, beyond even Rex. This was not just a machine completing a sequence. This was something learning that it had been found. The moment Caleb's hand crossed fully into the frame, the boundary between what he could see and what he could understand dissolved, not suddenly, not violently, but with a quiet precision that felt almost intentional, as if the system had been waiting not just for his presence, but for his willingness to step forward without resistance, and the space around his hand responded by stabilizing further, the faint distortion collapsing into something clearer, something structured in a way that did not rely on physical form alone. Rex remained still behind him, his presence steady, anchoring the connection in a way Caleb could feel without needing to turn around, and the pulse that had guided them from the beginning now aligned perfectly with everything happening within the frame, no longer separate signals, but one continuous rhythm. The interface at the center brightened slightly, not blinding, not overwhelming, but focused, as if narrowing its attention specifically on Caleb, and the information forming within it shifted again, no longer presenting itself as external data, but as something internal, something that did not need to be read because it was already understood the moment it appeared. Caleb felt it then, not as a thought, but as a realization unfolding from within, the structure of the system revealing itself not in pieces, but as a whole. And for the first time since entering the cave, he understood what this place had been designed to do. It was not storing information. It was preserving connection. It was never about control, Caleb said softly, his voice steady despite the depth of what he was realizing. It was about continuity. The words settled into the space around him, and the system responded, the light within the frame adjusting, the patterns shifting into a configuration that felt complete, as if the final piece had been placed exactly where it belonged. Caleb's hand remained steady within the interface, and as he held it there, the structure around it expanded slightly, not outward, but inward, deepening in a way that suggested not distance, but access, and new layers of information began to surface, not as images or text, but as understanding, as if the system was no longer showing him what it contained, but allowing him to experience what it was. He saw fragments then, not through his eyes, but through something deeper, brief moments that did not belong to him, yet felt familiar in a way that defied explanation. A network extending beyond the facility, beyond the mountain, beyond any single point that could be mapped or measured, connections forming between distant locations, each one responding to the same signal, each one part of a larger system that had never truly been isolated. He felt the presence of others, not individuals in the way he understood people, but points within the network, each one holding a similar pattern, a similar structure, and at the center of it all, the same constant remained. Rex. Caleb's breath slowed, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm as the realization deepened, because this was no longer about a single dog, or even a single mission. This was something that had been designed to endure, to persist, to remain active long after the people who built it had moved on or forgotten it entirely. You were never just part of a program, Caleb said quietly, his voice carrying a quiet certainty now. You were the continuation of it. Behind him, Rex shifted slightly, not stepping forward, not breaking the connection, but adjusting in a way that felt intentional, as if he was maintaining the balance of something Caleb could now feel, but not fully control. The system pulsed again, stronger this time, and the interface within the frame responded by narrowing its focus once more, the layers of understanding collapsing into a single, clear point. A final sequence began to form, not as a command, not as an instruction, but as a choice. Caleb felt it immediately, the difference in tone, the absence of directive, and the presence of possibility. The system was not asking him to complete it. It was offering him the option to define what came next. The realization settled into him with a quiet weight, and for a moment, he simply stood there, his hands still within the interface, his mind steady, his thoughts clear in a way they had not been in years. This was not about returning something to its original state. It was about deciding whether it should continue at all. He glanced back briefly, his eyes meeting Rex's, and in that moment, there was no confusion, no uncertainty, only a quiet understanding that passed between them without words. Rex did not move. He did not signal. He simply held Caleb's gaze, steady and present, as if reminding him of something simple, something that had never needed explanation. Caleb turned back to the interface, his focus narrowing once more, and slowly, deliberately, he withdrew his hand. The response was immediate. The light within the frame softened, not shutting down, not disappearing, but stabilizing into a calm, steady state, as if acknowledging the choice that had just been made. The layers of understanding receded slightly, not gone, but no longer overwhelming, and the system shifted from active engagement to quiet presence, like something that had been waiting for a decision and had now received it. The chamber behind him brightened slightly, the hum returning to its original tone, and Caleb exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest easing just enough to allow a different kind of clarity to take its place. It does not need to be controlled, Caleb said softly. It just needs to remain. Rex stepped forward then, closing the distance between them, his presence grounding Caleb in a way that nothing else could, and for a moment, the two of them stood there, not as subjects of a system, not as parts of something larger, but as themselves, connected not by design, but by something far simpler and far stronger. The system pulsed one last time, quiet and steady, and deep within the structure, something settled into place, not ending, not beginning, but continuing exactly as it was meant to. The chamber did not fall silent after Caleb withdrew his hand. It settled, like a breath finally released after being held for far too long, and the faint glow within the frame remained, steady and calm, no longer shifting, no longer reaching, but simply present, as if it had accepted its place without needing to prove it. Rex stood beside Caleb now, close enough that Caleb could feel the warmth of his body against his leg, grounding him in a way that the vastness of what he had just experienced could not take away. For a moment, neither of them moved, and the stillness that followed was not empty, but full, like the quiet that comes after understanding finally takes shape. Then, slowly, something else changed. It began as a distant sound, faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the low hum of the system, but different in tone, sharper, more mechanical, and Caleb's head lifted slightly, his focus shifting instinctively toward the direction of the cave entrance, far beyond the layers of stone and structure that surrounded them. Rex heard it too. His ears lifted, his posture adjusting just enough to signal awareness, not alarm, but attention, and Caleb felt a familiar tension return, not fear, but recognition of something external, something that did not belong to this place. "We are not alone anymore," Caleb said quietly, the words settling into the space between them with quiet certainty. The sound grew clearer, a rhythmic pulse that echoed faintly through the structure, distant but approaching, and Caleb did not need to see it to understand what it was. He had heard that sound before, in other places, under other skies, when something important had been found, or something that was not meant to be found had been uncovered anyway. Rex remained still, his gaze steady, not turning toward the sound, but holding his focus forward, as if the presence approaching did not change what had already been completed. Caleb exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing just slightly, and he looked back toward the frame, the quiet glow within it unchanged, untouched by whatever was happening beyond the walls of the cave. "They will not understand this," Caleb said, his voice calm, not dismissive, but certain, because what he had seen, what he had felt, was not something that could be explained through reports or measured through data. It was something that had to be experienced, something that could not be reduced to numbers or controlled through commands. The sound outside grew louder now, no longer distant, no longer faint, but present, a low vibration that moved through the structure, touching the edges of the chamber without disrupting it, and Caleb knew that they were close, closer than they needed to be, closer than he had expected. He glanced down at the collar still in his hand, its surface now still, its pulse gone, not because it had failed, but because it had finished what it was meant to do. "You brought me here," Caleb said softly, his eyes lifting to meet Rex's, and there was no question in his voice, only acknowledgement. Rex blinked once, slow and steady, and then turned his head slightly toward the corridor they had entered from, not moving yet, not leaving, but aware of the shift that was coming. Caleb nodded faintly, as if answering a question that had not been spoken, and then he took a final look at the frame, at the space that had revealed more than he had ever expected to find, and for a moment, he considered what it would mean to stay, to remain within this place where everything felt connected, where nothing had been lost, only waiting. But that was not what this had been about. This was not a place to remain. It was a place to understand. And now that understanding had been reached, the path forward was no longer here. The sound outside intensified briefly, then steadied, and Caleb turned away from the frame, his steps measured as he moved back toward the corridor, Rex falling into step beside him without hesitation, the two of them moving as they always had, not led, not commanded, but together. As they entered the passage, the light behind them softened further, not fading, but withdrawing, like something that no longer needed to call their attention, and the hum of the system returned to its original tone, steady and quiet, continuing without interruption. Caleb did not look back again. He did not need to, because whatever had been waiting there had not been lost when they stepped away. It had simply returned to what it had always been, present, connected, enduring beyond the need to be found again. The corridor stretched ahead of them, familiar now, no longer uncertain. And as they moved through it, the distant sound of the approaching presence followed, not chasing, not closing in, but arriving at a place that had already completed what it was meant to do. Caleb's steps remained steady, his breath even, and as the faint light of the cave entrance began to appear ahead, soft and natural compared to the controlled glow behind them, he felt something settle within him, not relief, not release, but something quieter, something that did not need to be named to be understood. Beside him, Rex walked with the same calm certainty, his presence unchanged, his purpose fulfilled without ever needing to be explained. And as they reached the edge of the cave, where the air shifted once more into the open world beyond, Caleb paused just long enough to take in the stillness of the trees, the movement of the wind, the simple reality of a world that did not know what had just taken place beneath its surface. Some things are not meant to be taken, Caleb said softly. Only understood. Rex stepped forward into the light without hesitation, and Caleb followed, leaving behind not a secret, not a discovery, but something far more enduring than either of those could ever be. The light outside the cave felt different after everything that had happened beneath the stone, softer in a way that did not ask questions, warmer in a way that did not need answers, and Caleb stood just beyond the threshold for a moment, letting his eyes adjust not to the brightness, but to the simplicity of it, the quiet sway of pine branches, the distant sound of wind moving through the valley, the kind of ordinary world that continued without ever knowing what lay hidden beneath its surface. Rex stepped forward onto the forest floor, his paws pressing into the earth with the same calm certainty he had carried through every chamber below, and when he paused, turning his head slightly as if listening once more, it was not toward the cave behind them, but outward, toward something ahead, something unseen but understood. Caleb followed slowly, the weight in his chest no longer heavy, no longer pressing, but settled into something quieter, something that did not need to be explained to be real. And as he reached the clearing just beyond the trees, he stopped again, not because he needed to, but because something in him recognized that this moment mattered in a way that could not be measured. The distant sound that had followed them from deep within the cave grew clearer now, no longer filtered through stone, no longer softened by distance, but present in the open air, the rhythmic thrum of approaching helicopters cutting through the stillness with a precision that did not belong to the forest. Caleb did not turn immediately. He did not react with urgency or concern. Instead, he looked down at the collar still resting in his hand, its surface quiet, its purpose complete, and for a moment, he simply held it, not as an object, but as something that had carried them to a place that no one else would understand. They will come looking for answers, Caleb said softly, his voice steady, not burdened by what that meant, and Rex remained still beside him, his gaze forward, his presence unchanged, as if the arrival of others did not alter what had already been decided. The sound grew louder, the air shifting with the movement of machines overhead, and Caleb finally lifted his eyes, not to the sky, but to the line of trees ahead, where the path forward remained open, untouched by the noise behind them. But not everything needs to be explained, he continued quietly, and there was no defiance in his voice, only certainty. Rex moved then, not toward the sound, not toward the approaching presence, but away from it, stepping into the deeper line of the forest with the same quiet confidence that had guided them from the very beginning. And Caleb followed without hesitation, leaving behind the open clearing, leaving behind the cave, leaving behind the place where something had been completed without ever needing to be claimed. The forest closed gently around them, the sound of the helicopters fading slightly as the trees absorbed the noise, turning it into something distant, something less immediate, and Caleb felt a sense of separation settle in, not as escape, but as distance from something that no longer belonged to him. He did not look back. He did not need to see who had arrived or what they would find, because whatever they discovered would never be what he had experienced. That could not be taken, documented, or controlled. It could only be lived. The path ahead was uneven, marked by roots and fallen leaves, but Rex moved through it with ease, his pace steady, his direction clear, and Caleb followed, his steps matching the rhythm without effort, as if the uncertainty that had once defined his movement had been replaced by something simpler, something more grounded. After a while, The sound of the helicopters faded entirely, replaced by the quiet language of the forest, the rustle of branches, the distant call of birds, the soft movement of air that carried no urgency, no demand. Caleb slowed slightly, his breath even, his mind clear in a way it had not been in years, and as he walked, he realized that nothing about him had changed in a way that could be seen, and yet everything felt different in a way that could not be undone. Beside him, Rex continued forward, his presence steady, his purpose fulfilled without ever needing recognition, and Caleb reached down absently, his hand resting briefly on the dog's back, feeling the warmth of his coat beneath his fingers, the quiet reassurance of something that had never needed to be questioned. "You never needed a system to be what you are," Caleb said softly, and Rex flicked his ears slightly, not in response to the words, but as if acknowledging something deeper than language. They walked like that for a long time, not toward a destination, not away from anything, but simply forward, step by step, the path unfolding as it always had, without needing to be mapped or explained. The sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground, and the lights softened into that quiet golden tone that made everything feel still for just a moment longer than it should. Caleb paused again, not because he had to, but because something in him recognized the quiet significance of the moment, and as he stood there, looking out through the trees, he understood something that did not need to be said out loud. Some things are not meant to be owned. Some things are not meant to be revealed. And some things, once found, are meant only to remain, exactly as they are, untouched, unseen, but never truly lost. Rex stepped forward once more, breaking the stillness with a